In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, life moved at its own gentle rhythm. People knew each other by name, and gossip traveled faster than the wind. It was the kind of place where everyone had their role, and, stepping outside of it often invited whispers and judgment. In this town lived a man named Daniel, an ordinary person with an extraordinary determination that would soon set him apart from everyone else. Daniel wasn't rich or famous. He didn't have a fancy degree hanging on his wall or a high-powered job in the city. Instead, he worked as a handyman, fixing broken fences, mending leaky roofs, and helping neighbors with odd jobs. Despite his modest lifestyle, Daniel had always been curious about how the world worked. He loved asking questions, sometimes to the point of annoyance, and spent hours reading books borrowed from the local library. His favorite topics were history and law, though no one really understood why. To most people, laws seemed complicated and boring, but Daniel saw them differently. To him, they were like puzzles waiting to be solved, full of hidden meanings and untapped potential. One day, Daniel's peaceful existence took a sharp turn when he found himself embroiled in a legal battle over a piece of land. The dispute started innocently enough, a disagreement with his neighbor over property lines. At first, Daniel tried to resolve the issue amicably. He approached his neighbor with a friendly smile and suggested they look at the old maps together to clarify the boundaries. But instead of finding common ground, the conversation escalated into a heated argument. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and before long, the matter spiraled out of control. The neighbor, who happened to be wealthier and more influential, hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit against Daniel. The news spread quickly through the town, and soon everyone had an opinion about the case. Some sided with Daniel, believing he was being treated unfairly. Others thought he should back down and avoid further trouble. What surprised everyone, however, was Daniel's decision to represent himself in court. "Why waste money on a lawyer?" he told his friends when they urged him to hire professional help. "I can do this myself." His confidence might have sounded admirable if not for the fact that Daniel had never set foot inside a courtroom before. Most people shook their head in disbelief, convinced he was setting himself up for failure. Despite the skepticism, Daniel threw himself into preparing for the trial. He visited the library almost daily, borrowing thick law books and scribbling notes in the margins. He read articles online, watched videos explaining legal procedures, and even attended a free seminar hosted by a retired judge. Every evening, after finishing work, he sat at his kitchen table surrounded by papers, highlighting important sections and organizing his thoughts. It wasn't easy. There were moments when frustration bubbled over and he slammed his fists on the table. But Daniel refused to give up. He reminded himself that this wasn't just about winning. It was about standing up for what he believed was right. As the date of the hearing approached, Daniel felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. He rehearsed his arguments in front of the mirror, practicing his tone and gestures. He imagined every possible question the judge might ask and prepared answers accordingly. Still, nothing could have prepared him for the reality of walking into the courthouse for the first time. The building loomed large and imposing, its marble floors gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. Inside, the air buzzed with activity. Lawyers in sharp suits scurrying around, bailiffs barking orders, and nervous defendants shifting uncomfortably in their seats. When Daniel entered the courtroom, all eyes turned to him. He wore his best outfit, a slightly wrinkled suit jacket paired with trousers that were a tad too short. Clutching a bulging folder filled with his notes, he took a deep breath and walked toward the plaintiff's bench. The room fell silent as the judge entered, a tall figure with a stern expression and a reputation for being tough on inexperienced litigants. Daniel swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. Little did he know, the next few minutes would test his courage in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The proceedings began smoothly enough, with the opposing counsel presenting their case. They spoke confidently, using technical jargon that made Daniel's head spin. When it was finally his turn to speak, Daniel stood up, his hands trembling slightly. He cleared his throat and began, his voice wavering at first but growing steadier as he continued. However, it didn't take long for the judge to interrupt him. Do you even know what you're doing? The judge asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The courtroom erupted into soft laughter, and Daniel felt his face flush red with embarrassment. For a moment, he considered sitting back down and giving up. But then something inside him clicked, a spark of defiance ignited by the unfairness of the situation. He clenched his jaw, determined not to let this moment break him. That night, as Daniel lay awake replaying the events in his mind, he realized two things. First, he couldn't rely solely on passion and goodwill to win this fight. Second, he needed to dig deeper, to find the tools that could level the playing field. And so, he resolved to go back to the one thing he trusted most, the Constitution. If anyone could teach him how to stand up against power and authority, it was the document designed to protect ordinary citizens like him. With renewed purpose, Daniel opened the worn-out copy of the Constitution he had borrowed from the library and began reading, line by line, until the early hours of the morning. What Daniel didn't realize yet was that this decision would change everything, not just for him, but for those watching closely from the sidelines. His journey was far from over, and the challenges ahead would push him to his limits. But somewhere deep inside, he already knew that this wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about proving to himself, and to the world, that anyone, regardless of background or resources, could rise above adversity with courage and conviction. That night, after the humiliating courtroom experience, Daniel sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, filling the silence that hung heavy in the air. His hands rested on the table, fingers tracing the edges of the folder he had brought home. Inside were his notes, scribbled reminders of arguments he hadn't gotten a chance to make and ideas that now felt foolishly inadequate. He replayed the judge's cutting words in his mind over and over again, each repetition stinging more than the last. "Do you even know what you're doing?" Those words echoed like a taunt, mocking not just his lack of legal expertise but also his decision to take on this fight alone. For a while, Daniel stared blankly at the stack of books piled haphazardly on the counter. Most of them were thick, law textbooks with titles he could barely pronounce. A few were self-help guides for people representing themselves in court, filled with tips that seemed too basic to be useful. But one book stood out among the rest, a worn-out copy of the U.S. Constitution. Its cover was faded from years of use, and its pages were dog-eared and marked with pencil notes left by previous readers. Daniel had borrowed it almost as an afterthought, thinking it might provide some vague inspiration. Now as he reached for it, he realized it was the only thing he hadn't fully explored yet. He opened the book slowly, flipping through its pages until he landed on the Bill of Rights. At first glance, the language seemed dry and old-fashioned, full of phrases that required careful thought to understand. But as Daniel read deeper, something clicked inside him. These weren't just dusty rules written centuries ago. They were promises. Promises made to protect ordinary citizens like him from unfair treatment, abuse of power, and injustice. Each word carried weight. Each clause held meaning. For the first time since the lawsuit began, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the answers he needed weren't buried in complex legal jargon or expensive lawyers' advice. Maybe they were right here in this simple document. Determined to learn everything he could, Daniel spent the next several nights poring over the Constitution. He underlined key sections, wrote summaries in the margins, and cross-referenced them with articles he found online. He learned about landmark cases where individuals had used constitutional rights to challenge powerful opponents. He discovered how the Fourth Amendment protected against unreasonable searches and seizures, how the Fifth Amendment guaranteed due process, and how the 14th Amendment ensured equal protection under the law. Every new piece of information fueled his growing confidence. Slowly but surely, Daniel began piecing together a strategy that revolved around these fundamental principles. What surprised Daniel most was how empowering the knowledge felt. Before, he had seen himself as an underdog, fighting an uphill battle against someone with far greater resources. Now armed with the Constitution, he started viewing the situation differently. He wasn't just a handyman arguing over property lines anymore. He was a citizen standing up for his rights. This shift in perspective transformed not only his approach to the case but also his entire outlook on life. Friends noticed the change when they visited. Gone was the hesitant man who doubted his abilities. In his place stood someone focused and resolute, ready to face whatever came next. As days turned into weeks, Daniel's preparation became almost obsessive. He practiced reading passages aloud from the Constitution, timing himself to ensure he wouldn't stumble during the hearing. He rehearsed responses to potential questions the judge might throw at him, weaving constitutional references into every answer. Evenings that once felt lonely and overwhelming now passed quickly, filled with purpose and determination. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to check on him, offering words of encouragement or sharing stories of their own struggles. Some admired his tenacity, while others still thought he was wasting his time. But Daniel didn't care what anyone else believed. He knew what he had to do. One evening, as Daniel flipped through the final pages of the Constitution, he stumbled upon a quote that resonated deeply with him. "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." The phrase struck a chord, reminding him why he had chosen this path in the first place. It wasn't about pride or proving others wrong. It was about defending the values he held dear: fairness, justice, and equality. With renewed energy, Daniel began drafting his argument, carefully linking the details of his case to the constitutional provisions he had studied. By the time he finished, the sun was rising outside, casting golden light through the window. Exhausted but satisfied, Daniel leaned back in his chair, knowing he had done all he could to prepare. When the day of the next hearing arrived, Daniel woke up early and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that looked slightly less awkward than before. He packed his folder meticulously, ensuring every document was in order. As he walked to the courthouse, he repeated his key points silently to himself, rehearsing the rhythm of his delivery. When he entered the courtroom, he noticed the same skeptical glances from spectators and the opposing counsel. But this time, Daniel didn't feel intimidated. Instead, he carried himself with quiet assurance, clutching the Constitution tightly in his hands. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense as the proceedings began. Once again, the opposing counsel presented their case first, speaking confidently, and presenting evidence designed to undermine Daniel's claims. The judge listened attentively, nodding occasionally to show approval. Then it was Daniel's turn. Taking a deep breath, he stood up, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him. For a moment, doubt crept in, threatening to derail his composure. But then he remembered the hours spent studying, the late nights, and the sacrifices he had made. Clutching the Constitution, he began to speak. At first, his voice wavered slightly, betraying nerves. But as he read directly from the document, citing specific clauses and connecting them to his argument, something remarkable happened. The room grew quieter, the murmurs fading into silence. Even the judge, who had previously dismissed Daniel with disdain, leaned forward in his seat, listening intently. Daniel's tone grew steadier, his words flowing more naturally as he explained how the Constitution supported his position. He referenced historical cases, tying them seamlessly to his defense, and emphasized the importance of protecting individual rights. By the time he finished, there was a palpable shift in the air. Though the verdict wouldn't come until later, Daniel knew he had accomplished something significant. No longer was he the ridiculed amateur struggling to find his footing. He had proven to himself and to others that passion, preparation, and belief in justice could overcome even the toughest obstacles. As he left the courtroom, he felt a sense of pride that no amount of mockery or criticism could diminish. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would inspire countless others and leave a lasting impact on his community. The courtroom felt different this time. Daniel noticed it the moment he stepped inside. The air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation. People whispered quietly as they took their seats, glancing at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Gone was the outright mockery from before, replaced by something harder to define. Perhaps respect tinged with doubt. Daniel walked to his bench with steady steps, clutching his folder tightly. Inside it lay not just papers but weeks of hard work, sleepless nights, and an unshakable belief in what he was fighting for. As the judge entered and everyone rose to their feet, Daniel reminded himself to stay calm. He had practiced his opening statement countless times, rehearsing until his voice grew hoarse. Yet as the opposing counsel began presenting their case, nerves crept back in. They spoke confidently, using complicated legal terms that made it sound like they were reciting poetry. Every word dripped with authority, leaving Daniel feeling small and outmatched. When it was finally his turn to speak, he stood up slowly, taking a deep breath to steady himself. His heart pounded so loudly he feared everyone could hear it. "I'd like to start," Daniel began, his voice trembling slightly, "by reading from the Constitution." There was a pause followed by faint murmurs in the room. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others exchanged puzzled looks. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. But Daniel didn't falter. Opening the worn-out book he had carried with him, he started reading aloud. At first his tone was hesitant, each sentence punctuated by brief pauses as he gathered courage. However, as he continued, his voice grew stronger, more assured. It wasn't perfect, he stumbled over a few words, but there was sincerity in his delivery that caught everyone's attention. The section he read focused on property rights and due process, principles outlined in the 5th and 14th Amendments. As Daniel explained how these protections applied to his situation, the atmosphere in the room changed. The initial skepticism gave way to curiosity. People leaned forward, listening closely as he connected constitutional clauses to real-life examples. One woman scribbled notes furiously while another man nodded thoughtfully. Even the opposing counsel stopped whispering to their assistant, their confident demeanor wavering ever so slightly. What truly captivated the audience, though, was Daniel's passion. He didn't just recite dry legal language. He brought it to life. He talked about fairness, about the idea that no one, not even someone with money or influence, should be above the law. His words weren't polished or rehearsed in the traditional sense, but they carried weight because they came from a place of genuine conviction. For the first time, Daniel wasn't just a handyman arguing over property lines. He was a citizen standing up for justice, armed with nothing but knowledge and determination. The judge, who had initially rolled his eyes at Daniel's unconventional approach, now listened intently. Leaning back in his chair, he stroked his chin as if considering the implications of what he was hearing. Occasionally he interrupted with pointed questions, trying to test Daniel's understanding. But instead of crumbling under pressure, Daniel responded calmly, citing additional clauses and explaining their relevance. Each answer reinforced his growing confidence, proving to everyone, including himself, that he belonged in that courtroom. The time Daniel finished his presentation, the room was silent except for the rustling of papers and the occasional cough. No one laughed or whispered anymore. Instead, there was a collective sense of awe, as if witnessing something unexpected and profound. Even the opposing counsel looked uneasy, exchanging quick glances with their client. Though Daniel couldn't predict the outcome, he knew he had made an impact. He had turned ridicule into respect, transforming the narrative of his case, and perhaps his entire life. Later that evening, as Daniel sat alone in his kitchen, the events of the day replayed in his mind. He remembered the judge's piercing gaze, the hushed whispers of spectators, and the moment when he realized he had silenced the room with his words. It was surreal, almost dreamlike. Yet, despite the progress he had made, Daniel couldn't shake off a lingering sense of uncertainty. The verdict was still pending and anything could happen. Would the judge rule in his favor, or would all his efforts amount to nothing? To distract himself, Daniel opened the Constitution again, flipping through its pages absent-mindedly. As he did, he stumbled upon a passage he hadn't paid much attention to before. It talked about perseverance, about the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. Reading those words gave him comfort. He realized that whether he won or lost, he had already achieved something remarkable. He had proven to himself that he was capable of far more than he ever imagined. That realization filled him with a quiet sense of pride, one that no court ruling could take away. Over the next few days, Daniel returned to his routine, fixing fences and mending roofs as if nothing had changed. Yet, things were different. Neighbors greeted him warmly, some stopping to congratulate him on his performance in court. A few even admitted they had underestimated him. "You really held your own out there," one man said, patting Daniel on the back. Others asked for advice, curious about how he had managed to stand up against such a formidable opponent. Daniel smiled modestly, deflecting praise with jokes about luck and timing. Despite the newfound admiration, Daniel remained grounded. He knew the fight wasn't over yet. The waiting period for the verdict stretched on, testing his patience and resolve. Some nights he lay awake wondering if he had missed something, if there was more he could have done. On other nights he dreamed of victory, imagining the look on his neighbor's face when the judge announced the ruling in his favor. Those dreams kept him going, fueling his optimism even during moments of doubt. Meanwhile, news of Daniel's courtroom performance spread beyond the town. Local reporters caught wind of the story, intrigued by the idea of an ordinary man taking on a legal battle with nothing but the Constitution as his guide. They reached out to interview him, asking questions about his preparation and motivations. At first, Daniel hesitated, unsure how to respond. But eventually, he agreed to share his experience, hoping it might inspire others facing similar challenges. "I'm not special," he told them repeatedly. "Anyone can do this if they're willing to put in the effort." The media coverage brought both attention and criticism. While many praised Daniel for his bravery and resourcefulness, others dismissed him as naive or lucky. Some lawyers argued that his success was an anomaly, warning against encouraging self-representation without proper training. But Daniel didn't let the negativity bother him. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. He knew the system wasn't perfect, but he also believed in its potential to protect those who dared to challenge it. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. Daniel woke up early, unable to eat breakfast or focus on anything else. As he dressed carefully and packed his folder, he felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. Walking to the courthouse, he repeated his key points silently, rehearsing responses to possible outcomes. When he entered the courtroom, he noticed familiar faces among the crowd, friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had come to witness the conclusion of his journey. Their presence gave him strength, reminding him that he wasn't alone. As the judge entered and called the court to order, Daniel took a seat, gripping the edge of the bench to steady himself. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone waited anxiously as the judge reviewed the case file one last time. Then, clearing his throat, he began to speak. His words were slow and deliberate, each syllable carrying immense weight. Daniel listened intently, his heart pounding louder with every passing second. Whatever the outcome, he knew this moment would change his life forever. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of papers and the occasional creak of a chair. Everyone leaned forward slightly, their eyes fixed on the judge as he adjusted his glasses and glanced at the documents in front of him. Daniel sat rigidly on the bench, his hands clasped tightly together. His knuckles were white from gripping them so hard, but he didn't notice. All he could focus on was the sound of the judge's voice, each word hanging in the air like a thread, waiting to snap. "The court has reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," the judge began, his tone measured and deliberate. He paused briefly, shuffling through some papers before continuing. "It is clear that this case involves not only a dispute over property lines but also questions about fairness and due process." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The mention of fairness felt like a small victory, even though nothing had been decided yet. The judge went on, summarizing the arguments made by the opposing counsel first. Their points sounded logical and polished, exactly what you'd expect from a professional lawyer. But when the judge turned to Daniel's side of the case, something remarkable happened. In representing himself, Mr. Daniel demonstrated an impressive understanding of constitutional principles, the judge said, glancing up at Daniel for a brief moment. There was no sarcasm in his voice this time, no hint of ridicule. Instead, there was a grudging respect that filled the room. Daniel blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. Was the same judge who had mocked him now acknowledging his efforts? The judge continued, explaining how Daniel had cited specific clauses from the Constitution and tied them directly to the issues at hand. While self-representation is often discouraged, it must be noted that Mr. Daniel's preparation and dedication were commendable. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some people nodded approvingly while others exchanged surprised glances. Even the opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably in their seat, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. For Daniel, the moment felt surreal. He had spent countless nights doubting himself, wondering if all his hard work would amount to anything. Now, hearing those words from the judge, he realized that his persistence had paid off, not just in terms of the case itself, but in earning recognition for his effort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge reached the verdict. After careful consideration, he announced, "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Daniel." The room erupted into whispers, and Daniel froze, unable to process what had just happened. Had he really won? It took a few seconds for the reality to sink in. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, followed by a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to his eyes. He hadn't just defended his property. He had proven to himself and everyone else that standing up for justice wasn't reserved for those with money or degrees. It was something anyone could do if they believed in it enough. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Daniel, microphones thrust toward him as cameras flashed. "How does it feel to win against such overwhelming odds?" one reporter asked. Another chimed in. "What advice would you give to others in similar situations?" Daniel blinked against the bright lights, still trying to adjust to the sudden attention. For a moment, he considered declining to comment, overwhelmed by the chaos. But then he remembered why he had fought so hard in the first place, not for fame or glory, but to inspire others to believe in themselves. "I feel grateful," Daniel said finally, his voice steady despite the whirlwind around him. "This wasn't easy, and I didn't do it alone. I relied on books, friends, and most importantly, the Constitution. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that knowledge is power. Anyone can stand up for their rights if they're willing to put in the work." His words resonated deeply with the crowd gathered outside. People clapped and cheered, some even patting him on the back as they passed by. Strangers approached him afterward, sharing stories of their own struggles and thanking him for giving them hope. Back home later that evening, Daniel sat in his kitchen, the noise and excitement replaced by peaceful silence. He poured himself a cup of tea and stared out the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The victory felt surreal, almost dreamlike. Part of him expected to wake up and find it had all been a fantasy, but the stack of congratulatory messages on his phone and the reporter's business cards scattered across the table reminded him it was real. Still, Daniel couldn't help but reflect on everything he had gone through to get here. He thought about the sleepless nights spent reading and studying, the moments of doubt that had threatened to derail him, and the ridicule he had endured in the courtroom. Each challenge had tested his resolve, pushing him to dig deeper than he ever imagined possible. Yet looking back, he wouldn't trade any of it. Those experiences had shaped him, turning him into someone stronger and more confident. More importantly, they had shown him the true value of perseverance and preparation. As the days passed, life began returning to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such a dramatic event. Neighbors stopped by regularly to congratulate him, bringing homemade pies and cakes as tokens of appreciation. Friends joked about how he should start offering legal advice, teasing him good-naturedly about his newfound expertise. Daniel laughed along, though he knew he wasn't cut out to be a lawyer. What he had done was personal, driven by necessity and passion. It wasn't about becoming an expert. It was about proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to give up. News of Daniel's victory spread far beyond the town, inspiring others facing similar battles. Social media lit up with posts praising his courage and determination. Some shared articles about his story, while Others organized community discussions about the importance of knowing your rights. Local schools invited Daniel to speak to students, hoping to instill a sense of empowerment in the younger generation. At first, Daniel hesitated, unsure if he was the right person for the role, but eventually he agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to make a difference. Standing in front of a classroom filled with curious faces, Daniel spoke candidly about his journey. He talked about the challenges he faced, the mistakes he made, and the lessons he learned along the way. "I'm not special," he told them repeatedly. "If I can do this, so can you. Don't let fear or doubt stop you from standing up for what's right." His words resonated deeply with the students, many of whom approached him afterward to thank him for sharing his experience. One girl even handed him a handwritten note, saying she wanted to become a lawyer because of him. Though Daniel never sought fame, his story became a symbol of hope for countless people. It reminded them that justice wasn't just for the privileged or well-connected. It was for everyone willing to fight for it. In the months that followed, Daniel returned to his quiet life, fixing fences and helping neighbors as he always had. But inside, he carried a newfound sense of purpose. He knew he might never face another courtroom battle, but he also knew he had already left a lasting impact, one that extended far beyond the boundaries of his small town. Every now and then, Daniel would pull out the worn-out copy of the Constitution from his bookshelf, flipping through its pages with a smile. It wasn't just a document anymore. It was a reminder of what he had achieved and the principles he stood for. And whenever someone asked him how he managed to win against such daunting odds, he simply shrugged and said, "I just did my homework and trusted myself." Life in the small town returned to its usual rhythm, but Daniel's victory continued to ripple through the community long after the headlines faded. People talked about him at coffee shops, grocery stores, and bus stops. His name became synonymous with resilience, a reminder that even the most ordinary individuals could achieve extraordinary things if they refused to back down. For Daniel, however, life remained largely unchanged, at least on the surface. He woke up early each morning, ate a simple breakfast, and headed out to work, just as he always had. Yet beneath his calm exterior, there was a quiet satisfaction that stayed with him, like a warm glow lighting up his days. Neighbors began treating Daniel differently. Before, he was simply the handyman, someone they called when something broke or needed fixing. Now he was more than that. He was a local hero. Some asked for advice not just about repairs, but about legal matters too. One elderly woman stopped him on the street, clutching a stack of papers related to her late husband's will. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Could you help me understand this?" Daniel smiled kindly and nodded, promising to guide her as best he could. Though he wasn't a lawyer, he knew enough to point her in the right direction, and more importantly, he understood how overwhelming legal jargon could feel. Helping her gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Word of Daniel's willingness to assist others spread quickly. Soon, people from neighboring towns started reaching out, seeking guidance on everything from tenant rights to small claims disputes. At first, Daniel hesitated, unsure if he should take on such responsibilities. After all, he had only represented himself. Advising others felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. But then he remembered why he had fought so hard in the first place, not for personal gain, but to show that justice was accessible to everyone. If sharing his knowledge could empower others, he decided, it was worth the effort. To manage the growing number of requests, Daniel set aside specific evenings each week to meet with those who needed help. He turned his living room into an informal office, arranging chairs around a table cluttered with books, notes, and copies of the Constitution. Each session began the same way. Daniel would listen patiently as visitors explained their problems, nodding occasionally to show he understood. Then together, they would dive into research, combing through laws and court cases to find solutions. It wasn't glamorous work, and it often required hours of tedious reading, but Daniel didn't mind. Watching someone leave his house with newfound confidence made every moment worthwhile. One evening, a young man named Marcus showed up unexpectedly. Unlike the others, Marcus didn't have a specific legal issue. Instead, He wanted to learn how to stand up for himself. "I see what you did," Marcus said, his voice filled with admiration. "And I want to be like you, someone who doesn't let people push them around." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It's not about being tough," he explained. "It's about believing in yourself and knowing your rights. That's half the battle right there." Over the next few weeks, Daniel mentored Marcus, teaching him how to read legal documents and think critically about arguments. Seeing Marcus grow more confident reminded Daniel of his own journey and reignited his passion for helping others, as you. Months passed. Daniel noticed subtle changes in the community. Conversations shifted from gossip to discussions about fairness and accountability. Locals organized workshops and discussion groups, inviting experts to speak about topics like property, rights contracts, and civil liberties. Even the library saw an increase in visitors borrowing law books and self-help guides. Daniel attended these events whenever he could, offering insights based on his experience. He never positioned himself as an authority figure. Instead, he emphasized the importance of learning and preparation. "Knowledge is power," he often repeated, "but it's useless unless you're willing to act on it." Despite the positive impact he was having, Daniel faced challenges too. Not everyone approved of his newfound role. Some lawyers in town grumbled about amateur advisors interfering in legal matters, while others dismissed his efforts as naive or reckless. A few even accused him of encouraging people to take unnecessary risks by representing themselves. These criticisms stung, especially when they came from people he respected. But Daniel chose to focus on the good he was doing, rather than the negativity aimed at him. He knew he couldn't please everyone, and frankly, he didn't try to. His goal was simple: to make a difference, one person at a time. The media attention eventually died down, replaced by newer stories and scandals. Reporters stopped calling, and the cameras disappeared from his doorstep. To Daniel, this was a relief. While he appreciated the initial spotlight, he preferred staying out of the limelight. Fame wasn't what he sought. Connection was. Whether it was helping a neighbor draft a letter or mentoring a teenager eager to learn, Daniel found joy in the everyday moments that brought people closer together. These interactions reminded him of the values he cherished most: community, fairness, and mutual support. Still, the memory of his courtroom victory lingered, shaping the way he viewed the world. Whenever doubt crept in, he reminded himself of the lessons he had learned during that difficult period. Preparation mattered, but so did courage. Standing up for what was right wasn't easy, but it was always worth it. And perhaps most importantly, no one had to face challenges alone. The support he had received from friends, neighbors, and even strangers had carried him through his darkest moments. Now he tried to pay that forward by being there for others. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected invitation in the mail. It was from a regional organization dedicated to promoting civic education and engagement. They wanted him to speak at their annual conference, sharing his story with educators, activists, and policymakers. At first, Daniel laughed nervously, convinced they had made a mistake. Why would they want me? He wondered aloud. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about him. It was about the message he represented. Reluctantly, he accepted the invitation, spending weeks preparing his speech. On the day of the conference, Daniel stood backstage, watching as attendees filed into the auditorium. Rows upon rows of seats filled rapidly, buzzing with anticipation. As his name was announced, he walked onto the stage, squinting against the bright lights. For a brief moment, fear gripped him, threatening to undo all his preparation. But then he spotted familiar faces in the crowd, friends, neighbors, and even Marcus, who had traveled hours to be there. Their presence steadied him, giving him the courage to begin. "I'm not here to tell you I'm special," Daniel started, his voice soft but clear. "In fact, my story proves the opposite. I'm just an ordinary guy who refused to give up. What I did, anyone can do, if they're willing to put in the work and believe in themselves." He went on to share his journey, weaving humor and humility into his narrative. By the end of his speech, the audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet in appreciation. Strangers approached him afterward, thanking him for inspiring them to take action in their own lives. One woman hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You've given me hope," she whispered. Returning home that night, Daniel reflected on the day's events. Speaking at the conference had been daunting, yet rewarding in ways he hadn't anticipated. More than anything, it reinforced his belief in the power of storytelling. Sharing his experiences wasn't just about celebrating his achievements. It was about reminding others that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the challenges that had shaped him, for the people who had supported him, and for the opportunity to inspire others. Though Daniel's life had changed in many ways, some things remained constant. He still worked as a handyman, still spent evenings poring over books, and still believed deeply in the principles outlined in the Constitution. But now, he carried something extra, a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had made a difference. Whether fixing a broken fence or guiding someone through a legal challenge, Daniel approached each task with the same determination and heart. And though he might never fully realize the extent of his impact, one thing was certain: his story would continue to inspire others long after he was gone. As the years passed, Daniel's story became a part of the town's fabric, woven into its history like the old oak tree in the center of the square. People didn't just remember him as the man who won a court case against all odds. They remembered him as someone who sparked change. His name came up in conversations about fairness, courage, and standing up for what was right. Children wrote essays about him in school, imagining themselves in his shoes, while adults shared his tale with newcomers to explain the kind of spirit that defined their community. Though Daniel never sought recognition, he couldn't escape the legacy he had created, one rooted not in grand gestures but in quiet determination. Daniel continued living his life much as he always had, rising early and spending his days fixing things that were broken. Yet there was a subtle difference. Now, he wasn't just repairing fences or unclogging drains, he was mending lives too. The informal meetings in his living room evolved into something more structured over time. With help from friends, he started hosting monthly workshops at the community center, teaching people how to navigate basic legal issues. These sessions weren't fancy, there were no PowerPoint slides or glossy handouts, but they were practical and heartfelt. Attendees left feeling empowered, armed with tools to tackle their own challenges. One day, during one of these workshops, a young woman named Lisa approached Daniel after everyone else had gone. She looked nervous, clutching a folder tightly against her chest. "I need your advice," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lisa explained that she was being unfairly treated at work, denied promotions despite her qualifications. Her employer dismissed her complaints, leaving her feeling helpless and frustrated. Daniel listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. When she finished, he smiled reassuringly. "You have rights," he told her, "and I'll help you figure out how to use them." Over the next few weeks, Daniel worked closely with Lisa, guiding her through the process of documenting incidents, gathering evidence, and understanding labor laws. Together, they drafted a formal complaint to file with the appropriate authorities. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and moments of doubt, but Lisa refused to give up. Watching her grow more confident reminded Daniel of his own journey. By the time the issue was resolved in her favor, Lisa had transformed from a timid employee into someone unafraid to advocate for herself. "Thank you," she said tearfully, hugging him tightly. "You gave me my voice back." Stories like Lisa's became common in the years that followed. Daniel's influence extended far beyond his immediate circle, touching lives in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Former attendees of his workshops began organizing similar initiatives in neighboring towns, spreading his methods and message. Some even went on to pursue careers in law or public service inspired by his example. One former participant, a teenager named Emma, eventually became a lawyer specializing in civil rights cases. Years later, when she returned to the town to visit Daniel, She handed him a framed photo of them together. "This is where it all started," she said, smiling. "Because of you, I found my purpose." Despite the widespread admiration, Daniel remained humble. He resisted efforts to turn him into a celebrity, declining invitations to write books or appear on television shows. "I'm just a regular guy," he would say whenever someone suggested otherwise. "My story isn't special. It's universal." What mattered most to him was staying grounded, continuing to live the same simple life he had always known. Even as strangers traveled from distant cities to meet him, he greeted each person with warmth and sincerity, treating them as equals rather than admirers. The town itself changed because of Daniel's impact. Civic engagement soared, with residents taking a more active role in local government and decision-making. Community meetings grew lively, filled with spirited debates about policies and priorities. Schools introduced programs focused on constitutional literacy, encouraging students to think critically about justice and equality. A mural depicting Daniel reading from the Constitution appeared on the side of the library, symbolizing the power of knowledge and perseverance. To those who knew him, it was clear that Daniel had planted seeds of change that would continue to grow for generations. Still, Daniel faced challenges along the way. Not everyone embraced his approach, and some criticized him for encouraging self-representation without formal training. Lawyers occasionally accused him of undermining the profession, while skeptics questioned whether his success could be replicated. There were moments when the criticism weighed heavily on him, making him wonder if he should step back. But every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself why he had started this journey: to make justice accessible to everyone, regardless of background or resources. That belief kept him going, even when the path felt uncertain. On his 60th birthday, the town threw a surprise party in his honor. Friends, neighbors, and former workshop participants gathered at the park, decorating tables with colorful streamers and balloons. Someone set up a slideshow featuring photos from throughout Daniel's life, childhood snapshots, images from his courtroom victory, and pictures of him mentoring others. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the festivities, the mayor took the stage to present Daniel with an award for outstanding community service. "You've taught us that anyone can stand up for justice," the mayor said, his voice filled with emotion. "And for that, we are forever grateful." Daniel accepted the plaque humbly, thanking everyone for their support. But what moved him most was the heartfelt speeches given by those he had helped. One by one, they stood up to share how he had changed their lives, often choking up as they spoke. Lisa talked about finding her courage, while Marcus described discovering his passion for advocacy. Emma recounted how Daniel's guidance had set her on a new career path. Each story reinforced the ripple effect of his actions, showing him that his efforts had touched countless lives in ways he might never fully understand. That night, as Daniel sat alone in his kitchen reflecting on the day's events, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He thought about the obstacles he had overcome, the lessons he had learned, and the relationships he had built along the way. His journey hadn't been perfect. There had been mistakes, doubts, and moments of fear, but it had been meaningful. More than anything, it had shown him the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what was right. Before heading to bed, Daniel pulled out the worn-out copy of the Constitution from his bookshelf. Its pages were frayed now, the edges yellowed with age. He flipped through it slowly, tracing the words he had read so many times before. They still held the same weight, the same promise. Closing the book, he placed it back on the shelf and turned off the light. As he drifted off to sleep, he smiled, knowing that his story, his fight, wasn't truly his alone. It belonged to everyone who dared to believe in justice, fairness, and the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all.